Hello, American Stroke Foundation. My name is Sarah Nestler, and I am an occupational therapy student currently doing field work at American Stroke Foundation. And today I want to present to you about driving after your stroke. There are many people who may be interested in driving and have a goal to get back to driving after your stroke. There may be people who currently do drive, and then there are also some people who at this point don't have much interest in driving, and that is okay. But throughout this presentation, I'll cover all those aspects and try to get you the most information I can about driving after your stroke. So we'll go ahead and get started. And for an overview about what I'll cover during this presentation, I'll start with an introduction to driving and get you some background information about driving, and then we'll head into how your stroke can affect your driving. Next, we will cover the driving rehabilitation evaluations that you can have done. After that, we'll move into the modifications and adaptive equipment that are available for driving. And finally, we'll end the presentation with some of the resources that are here in Kansas City for those driving evaluations. So this is just a little comic I found that I thought was funny that I would share, and it says a modern driving test, and it has the driving instructor saying, "Now I want you to steer with your knees as you talk on the phone, eat some fast food, and put on makeup in the rearview mirror," which is not the case for the driving evaluations that I will talk about later. But I thought this was funny because nowadays you see this so often, people driving while eating or putting on makeup, all of the above. But like I said, this is not what will happen. I'll tell you what will happen in the driving evaluations in the coming slides. So to begin with our introduction, I want to talk about how driving can represent choice, freedom, and self-identity. Many people believe that having a driver's license and being able to drive can represent that independence and freedom. You can easily get yourself from one place to the next whenever you want without having to rely on someone else to get you to those places. And when you are able to drive, you have that independence and choice to decide when and where you want to go. On the flip side, not driving can lead to social isolation. Of course, this isn't the case for everyone, but when you're not able to get to the places you want to go, hang out with the people you want to hang out with, and you are at home, potentially alone, that is when that instance can lead to social isolation. Again, this isn't always the case. Some people have caregivers or family, friends, neighbors, whoever it may be that can get them to one place to from one place to the next if you're not driving, or there are resources in the Kansas City area that can provide that transportation for you that can decrease that social isolation. But sometimes people don't have that option, and then on top of that, not being able to drive, that's when you um, can get yourself into a social isolation place. Moving on to that third bullet, driving is a complex issue. It is a very tough activity to do. It requires a lot of different stimuli and things going on at once. That's why I say it's a complex issue. And then once you have had that stroke, it becomes even more of a complex activity because of those secondary effects of the stroke. We'll get into further detail about all those different secondary effects of stroke in the coming slides. But that leads me to my next point. As OTs, we have a term called an instrumental activity of daily living, or an IADL. This pretty much just means activities that support your daily activity within your home or community. This could be caring for a pet, or meal prepping, or financial management. But one of the IADLs that we as OTs address is driving. And out of all of the IADLs that I just mentioned that we as OTs look at, driving is considered the most complicated and dangerous. It takes a lot of concentration, a lot of different stimuli coming at you at once, and that's why it's so complicated and dangerous. On the flip side, though, driving is considered the most meaningful IADL that OTs address. Like I talked about in the last few slides, driving can really represent independence to people. And without driving, you could experience some social isolation, and that's why it's so meaningful to people. It's a way for people to socialize and get to know other people when you go out and meet people. Because it is such a meaningful activity, that's why one of the reasons why I wanted to do an entire presentation on it today. So when I say that driving is the most complicated activity, this is what I mean. In order to drive safely, it requires many different aspects, including planning, such as you need to plan out your route. So when you leave your house, how do you get from your house to the grocery store? It requires concentration. You have to limit distractors. You need to be able to anticipate different things. So you need to anticipate other cars that might be coming towards you, or you need to anticipate that when you see a soccer ball rolling out into the middle of the street, that a child or the person playing with that soccer ball might be slowly or following after that ball. You need to have the ability to problem solve and problem solve pretty quickly. You also have to be able to interpret all of the different stimuli that are coming at you. This is complex and changing stimuli. And then finally, my last point is you need to have the motor responses that are prompt, effective, and calm while you're driving as well. So all of those make up a safe driving activity, and that's why driving is so complex and complicated. And these are the areas that after having a stroke can be affected and that play directly into driving. So we'll talk about these 5 areas in the coming slides. That'll be physical impairments, vision problems, cognitive effects, fatigue, and finally epilepsy. Many of you may be familiar with these, but like I said, I'm going to go into further detail about every single one of them in the next coming slides. So we will start with the physical impairments. So for the physical side effects after having your stroke, we will first talk about hemiplegia. So this is the paralysis of one side of your body, commonly your arm, your hand, and your leg. And this is considered the most common side effect following a stroke. So when you have this paralysis on one side of your body, that can make driving a lot more difficult, whether that's trying to steer or turn with one hand, or whether that's maybe your right side is weaker than your left side, so your right side is affected, and that makes pushing on the gas and the brake a lot more difficult. You can also experience more tone in your arm or leg that would restrict movement as well. So all of those make driving more difficult. Moving on to the sensory problems, your stroke may affect your sensation in your arm and or leg. Some may feel numbness or a pins and needles sensation throughout your feet or your hands, to a point where you could lose feeling in those areas. And this could be problematic if, say, you're feeling that in your foot and you're unable to um, tell if you're on the gas or the brake. That could lead to issues when driving. And finally, the last grouping down there, pain and dizziness. You could experience muscle spasms or even vertigo due to your stroke, which would cause driving to become more difficult. So some of the areas where physical impairments would make driving more difficult, I touched on a few of these, but difficulty feeling the pedals, differentiating between the gas and the brake, difficulty keeping a firm grip on the steering wheel in order to steer or make those turns. Um, Another one would even be difficulty putting on your seatbelt. All of those will make driving more difficult and harder. We will now move on to vision problems you may experience following your stroke. So, according to Flint Rehab, about 2/3 of survivors of stroke encounter some sort of vision problem. This can include any form of vision impairment, such as blurred or double vision. So you may be looking ahead while driving and there's one car coming at you, but you are seeing two cars coming at you. It could include problems with depth perception. So, again, if you have a car coming at you, you may be having difficulty telling how far away that car is or even how fast that car is coming at you. You may have problems or loss of your central vision, so seeing in front of you, and then also loss of peripheral vision. So that would be seeing to the right or the left side, for instance, to be able to check blind spots. Another difficulty you might have if your vision is affected would be distinguishing or reading street signs. So, what does the speed limit sign say, or what does that street sign say the name of this street is? It may cause you to have problems seeing cars or people. And then also, if your vision is affected, it might become extremely difficult to drive in certain light conditions, such as at night. It might become a lot harder to drive, or in different weather conditions like fog or rain, even snow. If your vision is affected, that could cause driving to be more difficult as well. We will move on next to the cognitive effects. So after your stroke, um, you may have more problems with your memory, your concentration, your problem solving, and even multitasking. So, with driving, not only do you have to physically be able to drive, but you need to have the mental ability to drive as well. So, with memory, short term memory could be remembering your route, like I mentioned, from your house to the grocery store or from your house to your friend's house. And then long term could be affected as well. That could mean, are you able to remember how to turn on the car, or are you able to remember the um, basic rules of the road and the actual aspect of safe driving on the road? concentration, taking information in, as well as staying focused. So, are you able to focus on the road and what is going on around you? Are you able to not get distracted by your passenger next to you talking to you, or not getting distracted by the radio that is on, whether that be listening to the radio or changing the radio, either one. Moving on to the problem solving, so ways to begin or finish a task. So, like I said, maybe that could relate to how to avoid a crash. If cars coming at you, you need to problem solve out of that situation fairly quickly, probably, and figuring out how to avoid that crash. Again, multitasking would be driving while turning on or off the radio, um, things like that while multitasking. A cognitive issue that could also be present after your stroke would be slower response times to, if you're driving towards a sign, responding to what that sign says, if it's a stop sign, say, for instance. Next, we will move on to fatigue. So, fatigue is another common effect of stroke that could impair your driving abilities. Fatigue can make it difficult to stay focused while driving, as well as make it difficult to make quick judgments on the fly. And then, even in severe cases of fatigue, it could cause you to fall asleep at the wheel, which is something we do not want to happen. So, if you are experiencing any post stroke fatigue, it's important to make sure that you are able to get that fatigue under control before returning to driving. Now we will move on to epilepsy. Some survivors of stroke experience epilepsy, which is having a seizure. So, according to Flint Rehab, again, about 5 to 10% of survivors of stroke will experience a seizure after a stroke. You may have one seizure, or you could have multiple seizures. Having multiple seizures is when it is considered epilepsy. There are driving restrictions if you have had a seizure. Before returning to driving, following a seizure, you will need to be cleared by a doctor and also by the DMV. So, checking with them to know what their restrictions are. Typically, you can be cleared after being seizure free for 6 months. Again, you would want to check with your doctor and the DMV to clarify that information. But yes, typically it is being seizure free for 6 months. So, even though I just went through some of the possible effects that the stroke has left you with, you may still be able to drive. So, at this point, how do you know if you are fit to drive after your stroke? We will go into further detail about that. So, to begin, you may want to do one of these self screening tools. I think this is a great initial test to see how you feel about driving, because both of these two tools are free and they're very easily accessible. You can find them online by simply Googling their name and it'll come up. So the first one here on the left is called Driving Safely While Aging Gracefully, a self-assessment. And on this website, there are a series of questions that pertain to vision, physical fitness, reaction time, other areas like that. And based off of your answers to the questions, you can decide how you feel about driving, because the questions bring up topics that maybe you hadn't thought about before or weren't aware of that pertain to driving. And so then after that, there are helpful tips that follow each section. So this website is just a list of question after question to think about, either think about in your head, or you can talk to um, a family member or a caregiver about it. And you can discuss through those and then look at the helpful tips. The second option on the right side, called Fitness to Drive Screening Measure Online, is an online screening tool and questionnaire that can either be filled out by you as the driver, or as the caregiver can fill it out as well. It asks specific questions pertaining to how the driver drives. And after the screening tool is completed, you are then provided with a written report with an overall rating of how they would assess your driving, and specific and general recommendations of where to go from there. Again, these two options are both free and easily accessible online. So that is why I suggest that this would be a good place to start if you are interested in driving again, just to quickly assess where you are without having to pay money. So those are the self-screening tools. The next step in the process would be to go through a driving rehabilitation evaluation. So I will go into further information about that. The first step before getting in a car as part of the driving rehabilitation evaluation process would be going to a clinical evaluation. This will take place in an outpatient clinic and will be done by a certified driving rehabilitation specialist, which is commonly an occupational therapist. And this usually takes about an hour to an hour and a half to complete the clinical evaluation part. During the clinical evaluation, you will be screened in these 4 different areas. You will be screened for vision, a visual perception screening. They will look at your cognitive skills, and finally, they will look at your physical function. So going to the vision screening part, they'll look at your acuity. They'll look at your depth perception. So like we talked about before, if a car is coming at you, can you tell how far away they are? They'll look at your color perception. So are you able to tell what color signs are on the side of the road, or what color a stoplight is on, red, yellow, or green? For their ocular motor control, that is being able to control where your eyes move and their position. So what are you looking at? Can you control what your eyes are looking at? Saccadic eye movements are the rapid movements of the eye. So as you're scanning and looking at the street ahead of you, can your eyes move back and forth? Near to far point fixation. So can you look at the stoplight that's pretty far in front of you, and then can you move to the car that is directly in front of you and back and forth? As for the visual perception screening, visual closure and form constancy are 2 things that I will discuss in the next 2 slides. So we'll come back to those. Cognitive skills, they're going to look at your driver knowledge. So that is the basic rules of the road, what street signs mean, things like that, like what you would think of for a driving test when you go get your license. They're going to look at your processing speed, your attention, memory, your ability to make decisions and judgment, and then finally your impulsivity. For the physical function aspect, they're going to look at your transferabilities. So are you able to get in and out of the car safely? They're going to look at how you sit and your sitting balance and your trunk control. They'll look at your arm function, your leg and foot function, your reaction speeds, and then finally your neck rotation ability. So can you turn your neck to check those blind spots? Things like that. So for the next two slides, we'll go on to the visual perception screening. First, we'll look at visual closure, which is the ability to see a portion of an object or see it even just very briefly and be able to recognize it correctly by mentally completing the image. So for example, this picture down below, we have a stop sign that is partially covered by trees. And so I can only see a sliver of the stop sign. But during the screening, they will check to see if you are able to see a sliver of the stop sign. Are you able to tell and complete the rest of the picture? And are you able to know that as you approach that, you need to come to a stop and check to make sure the road ahead of you is clear? That's what visual closure is. The next is form constancy. So this is the ability to recognize that a shape remains the same even if it is changed in size, direction, orientation, or distance. So for example, this picture on the left, the stoplight, we typically see stoplights vertically. These stoplights in this picture are horizontal. So even though they are horizontal, they've changed in orientation. Even though that's the case, can you still recognize that the red stoplight is on the left, and then a yellow will come next, and then the green light? And are you able to understand what that means? For the picture on the right, we are looking across the intersection at the back of a hexagon. So knowing that that is a hexagon, do we know that the other side is going to be a red stop sign? And then therefore, do you know that any car that approaches that intersection will stop there? That's kind of what form constancy means. So all of that is being evaluated in the clinical evaluation portion. After you have been cleared from the results of the clinical evaluation, then you are ready for the behind the wheel evaluation and to do the driving evaluation. So again, this happens with the driving rehabilitation specialist. It will typically last about an hour and a half, 90 minutes, and you will complete this behind the wheel evaluation in a properly equipped vehicle. So the place you do your evaluation at, they will have a car that is properly equipped, which means that on the passenger side of the car, there's where the driving specialist will be seated, there's an emergency brake is pretty much what a properly equipped vehicle means. On the right side, you see that during this behind the wheel evaluation, there will be a gradual progression of traffic complexity. So you will begin the evaluation in a vacant parking lot, so no other cars or obstacles around. Then you will progress to a low traffic residential area. And then you will progress to a moderate or heavy commercially trafficked area, such as making your way to the grocery store might be more heavily trafficked, or parking in a parking lot at the grocery store would be an example as well. And then finally, if you are interested, and not everyone's interested in this, but if you are interested in driving on the highway or interstate, then they would progress to that area, to a highway or interstate, to finish out the evaluation. So after those two parts of the driving evaluation are complete, the driving specialist will come back to you with the outcome of your driving evaluation. So they may say that the first option would be to resume driving with no restrictions. So you passed, you're cleared, you're good to go to start driving. They may come back and say that you can resume driving with restrictions and or adaptive equipment. So for example, restrictions could be only driving during the day when it's light out. So no nighttime driving. They could restrict the areas you drive, such as only driving um, within a 5 mile radius of your house. So only going to the grocery store or church or doctor's appointment, such as that. Um, that would be the type of restrictions they might put in place. As for the adaptive equipment part of that outcome, that is something we will get to in the later slides, all of the adaptive equipment that is available. Moving on to this third option, driver's training. That is training with a driving instructor or a therapist. The goal of this is to improve your driving skills and reduce any bad habits that you may have. If they suggest for you to have adaptive equipment put into your car, they would also suggest you to do driver's training then to practice with that adaptive equipment. So this driver's training could be anywhere from 2 to 3 hours or upwards of 30 hours if you're practicing with that adaptive equipment. Down at the bottom on the left, an outcome could be right now you're not appropriate for driving, but in the future, I would like to refer you back for future evaluation. So that could be an outcome. And then lastly, the last outcome would be we just don't see that you're fit to drive and we would suggest that you discontinue driving. So if that is suggested that you should not be driving, you still have plenty of other options about how to stay socially active and interacting with people and how to stay independent. That could be transportation resources within the Kansas City area, such as Ride KC or Z Trip, or that could be having a caregiver or a family or friend offered to drive you places, things like that. There are options for you. So those are all of the outcomes that could come from the driving evaluation. We will then move on to, these are some of the requirements I found pertaining to Kansas and Missouri driver's licenses. So for Kansas, on the left side, you are required to renew your driver's license every 6 years. And after the age of 65, then it becomes every 4 years. In Kansas, it is not mandatory to report. If you do report, then it is anonymous and you report by letter. And excuse me, the driver that you reported would then be notified in writing. And then finally, I found some restricted licenses that are offered in Kansas. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, that could be driving only during the daylight or not driving on highways and interstates. So just driving within city limits. Those are some of the restricted licenses that are offered in Kansas. Now moving on to the Missouri side, your driver's license has to be renewed every 6 years. And after the age of 70, then it becomes every 3 years. As for reporting drivers that may be unfit to drive, in Missouri, that is encouraged, but it's not mandatory. And if you do report, then you are kept anonymous and you would report by letter or form. Missouri also offers some restricted licenses as well. Again, that can be restrictions to how fast you can go, how far you can go, the time of day, and then also your doctor can recommend some restricted licenses for you. Now, on to the modifications in adaptive equipment that are available for driving. So, there are many options that can help you drive after having a stroke, which is really exciting. We will go through a few of the options that may be useful to you. And throughout the driving rehabilitation evaluation that you went through, your driving specialist would let you know what adaptive equipment and modifications they would suggest for you. Adding this adaptive equipment to your driving can add significant complexity to your driving, and it will usually take quite a bit of time to learn how to properly use the equipment. But ultimately, these modifications that are suggested to your driving are suggested in hopes to making driving more accessible and easier for you. So that's why we want to talk about them, to get you back to driving if that is your goal. So, the first portion of modifications I want to talk about pertain to entering and exiting the car. This first one is called a car topper. So this would be for someone who uses a wheelchair. Your driver's seat would come out of the car and spin. You can see the man here sitting in it. And that would make transferring from your wheelchair to the driver's seat easier. And then your wheelchair would be lifted up the side of your car and into that white box on the top. So it would kind of look like those extra luggage toppers you can put on top of a car, but this one would store your wheelchair if you use a wheelchair. The next one is a power transfer seat. So the driver's seat, as you can see here, slides back and turns. So again, this is to make transferring from your wheelchair to the driver's seat more accessible. And at the bottom of the picture, you can see that there is also a ramp going from the car to the pavement to make that entry into the car easier and more accessible as well. So that's a power transfer seat. Next is the handy bar, which will make transferring from the car to standing more easier. So this is inserted into the loop of your door frame, as you can see on the picture on the left. This is a stable and steady option to help you get out of the car. So it's not going to move on you like, for instance, your walker might, or your car door might move. This handy bar is going to be, it's not going to move, and it'll help get you out of your car. Because a lot of cars can be kind of low to the ground, which makes getting out of the car much harder. And these can be used if you are the driver or if you're a passenger in the car as well. Every door has one of these loops of the door frame, so you can use it as the passenger as well. And these can be found for $15 to $30 on Amazon or in Walgreens and Walmart. But yeah, they are $15 to $30. And they can help make transferring from standing, from sitting in the car to standing much safer. The next thing is a seatbelt grabber. So this would attach to your seatbelt and would make reaching for your seatbelt easier if you have limited shoulder movement. And these run for about $10 from Walgreens. This next thing I found is called a leg lifter, and you attach or loop the piece of fabric underneath your foot um, of your affected or weaker side, and then you pull on the fabric to lift it up into the car. Again, these can be used as the driver if you have an affected side, or they can be used as the passenger as well. These run about $10 to $20 on Amazon and Walmart. I found them on Walmart as well. So again, that just makes entering and exiting the car a little bit easier. They may suggest you to get a seat cushion if you need to be elevated up in your seat a little bit more. This is an actual seat cushion, or some people might use a pillow, but a seat cushion would be more stable and less movable. So again, that would be to increase your elevation on the seat. This key holder is about $10 to $15 on Amazon, and it's used if you have a little bit more difficulty holding a key because they're so small, and using that fine motor movement can be more difficult. So by adding the key holder, it becomes a larger thing to hold onto and to grip onto as well. A lot of cars nowadays just use push to starts or push buttons to start the car. So car keys are kind of going out of style. But something like this could also be used for your house key or any other type of key you might use. So again, these are $10 to $15 off of Amazon. As for the steering modifications that are available, we've got a steering knob. This would be useful if you have one affected arm or weaker arm where you're going to use just one arm to steer onto. So you've got a knob to hold on to, and you can steer with one hand much easier. That's one picture, and then this is another picture of it. It just attaches onto the steering wheel. Some look like this where they're more of sticks. Some look like actual knobs you hold onto. As for the modifications for accelerating and braking, we've got the left foot accelerator. So this picture on the left is more of a permanent change, and the picture on the right, which is a little bit harder to see, is a non-permanent change. So I'll talk about both of them. So the one on the left, you see that the original gas pedal is pushed up and out of the way. You've got the same brake pedal, and then you've got the new gas pedal on the left. So you would use your left leg to then push the gas and the brake. And this would be used if your right side is weaker and your right leg specifically is weaker. Then the one on the right, which like I mentioned is harder to see, but you have the left gas on the left side, which is attached to that silver bar that reaches over to the right-sided gas. So when you push the left gas, it also at the same time pushes down on the active right gas. And then you have the brake in the middle, and then over the top of the original gas pedal is a a shield so that you don't have two active gas pedals at the same time. So when this is installed, you can only push the left gas. And then when you, if you want someone else to drive the car, you can take this out, uninstall it, and someone else can drive the car with the right gas pedal. So, like I said, the picture on the left is a change that is more permanent, and then the picture on the right is you can change it so that if you have someone else, such as a spouse, that is needing to use the car, then they could go back to using the right-sided gas pedal. So the next is potentially using hand controls to control the gas and the brake. So you would just reach slightly under the steering wheel to push those pulls that would then push the gas and the brake in. Moving on to secondary control modifications. Sometimes they might modify the ignition or gear shift, so adding this more of a touch screen to be able to change those options. There's the ability to adapt the turn signal or windshield wipers. So in this picture, first of all, I want to point out the steering knob. That brown knob attached to the steering wheel would help with that one-handed turning. And then they have the adaptive equipment on the turn signal. So instead of turning the turn signal with your left hand, you would have this piece of equipment that then wraps around to the right side, and you could flick that equipment with your right hand to turn on the turn signal. This could also be adapted for the windshield wipers, where if your right hand was weaker and unable to turn on the windshield wiper, then it could wrap around to the left side and you could use your left hand to turn on that windshield wiper. So that mostly concludes the modifications or adaptive equipment that might be suggested to you throughout that evaluation process. Now I want to move on to the resources within the Kansas City area that are available to you for those driver evaluations. So the first one is Ability KC offers the clinical and behind the wheel evaluation. Both those are available at Ability KC, and that process would take about 3 hours in total. So you would have an hour and a half of clinical evaluation and an hour and a half of behind the wheel. That program costs $483. And unfortunately, that is usually out of pocket costs. It is most likely not covered by insurance because insurance sees driving as more of a luxury rather than a necessity. Most driving rehabilitation evaluation programs offer payment plans, though, if that is needed. But just be aware that the cost of these 3 resources in the Kansas City area are typically out-of-pocket costs. The next one in the middle is Avenues Driving Rehabilitation Program. Again, this program offers both the clinical evaluation and the behind the wheel evaluation, and this program typically is $500. The last option on the right side, KU Driving and Mobility Clinic, they do the clinical evaluation. They do not do the behind the wheel evaluation. So that is why the cost is $260. They can provide you with advice on the car modifications and any adaptive equipment. But again, if you want to be cleared for the behind the wheel part, you would need to go to either Ability KC or Avenues Driving Rehabilitation Program. All three of these resources within the Kansas City area will provide you with um, a medical related evaluation. So, based off of you having a stroke, they will tell you if you should or should not be driving and any modifications that they might suggest as well. So that covers the resources within the Kansas City area, and also that concludes my presentation about driving after your stroke. So I hope you were able to learn a little bit about the side effects following your stroke, as well as the evaluation process and all of the different adaptive equipment that is available to help you drive safely after having a stroke. So I appreciate you all listening to my presentation. Thank you.